When I told Mark I needed surgery, I expected him to be my rock, my support, the partner I had always counted on. Instead, he shrugged and muttered, "I'm too busy." Those words shattered my heart, echoing in the sterile hospital room like a cruel joke. I was left alone to face my fears, my vulnerability laid bare, while he vanished into his world of work and meetings. It was in that moment of deep betrayal that I realized I had a choice: to accept this neglect or to reclaim my life and dignity. Before I dive into my story, let me know in the comments how you would handle such betrayal. And if you resonate with my journey, consider subscribing. Your support fuels my voice. Now let's get into the heart of my experience. The night I told Mark about my surgery, I expected, at the very least, a flicker of concern in his eyes. Instead, he glanced at his phone, scrolling absent-mindedly, and said, "I'm too busy right now." The words echoed in the sterile hospital room, sharp and cold, cutting deeper than any scalpel could. I stared at him, disbelief washing over me like a tidal wave. How could the man I married, the one I thought would stand by me through anything, brush off my need for surgery with such indifference? I was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, a thin hospital gown barely covering me, my heart pounding not just from the fear of the operation but from the sheer loneliness of facing this alone. My hands trembled as I held the paperwork the doctor had just handed me, a date for the surgery, detailed instructions, and a bill that seemed to mock me with its hefty sum. Mark, my husband of 8 years, barely looked up from his glowing screen. "I've got meetings back-to-back this week," he muttered. "You'll be fine. Just get it done." Those words slammed into me harder than any diagnosis could. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him understand that this wasn't just a minor inconvenience or a routine checkup. This was my body, my life, and I needed him. But he was elsewhere, trapped in his own world of deadlines and phone calls, leaving me stranded in mine. I am Emily, a woman who once believed in the strength of marriage, in the promise that for better or worse meant standing united when life threw its worst at you. 8 years ago, Mark and I vowed to be partners in everything, to build a life where we supported each other's dreams and fears alike. But now, sitting in that cold hospital room surrounded by beeping machines and sterile walls, I felt like a stranger to the man beside me. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mark had always been the ambitious one, climbing the corporate ladder with a fervor that sometimes left me dizzy. I admired that drive. I stood by him through late nights and missed dinners, cheering him on while quietly tending to the home we built together. But tonight, his relentless pursuit of success felt like a betrayal, his busyness a barrier between us when I needed him most. As I quietly packed my hospital bag, Mark kept tossing out excuses about why he couldn't take time off. "You know how important this quarter is. I can't just drop everything." I wanted to tell him that my health was the most critical quarter of all, that the surgery was about survival, not spreadsheets. But I swallowed the words, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle deep in my chest. The night dragged on, every minute stretching painfully as I waited for the moment I would be wheeled into the operating room. Mark's absence was a glaring void. No hand to squeeze, no whispered reassurance, just silence punctuated by the distant hum of hospital activity. When the nurse asked if I wanted someone to stay with me until surgery, I hesitated, then shook my head. The truth was, I felt abandoned, and no one else's presence could fill the space Mark left behind. In the days leading up to the surgery, the tension between us grew thicker. I tried to talk to him, to explain how scared I was, how much I needed his support. Each time he offered a distracted nod or a distracted smile, his mind clearly elsewhere. When I asked if he'd come to the hospital, his answer was the same: "I'm too busy." The sting of those words never dulled. I remember one particular evening when I sat at the kitchen table, the glow of the overhead light casting shadows on the empty chair where Mark usually sat. I held my phone tightly, ready to dial his number, hoping for a sliver of comfort. When he finally answered, his voice was rushed, almost impatient. "Emily, I told you I have a meeting. Can this wait?" I wanted to cry, to scream, to beg him to just be there. But instead I whispered, "I'm scared." The line went quiet for a moment, then he said, "I'll check in later." Later never came. That night I lay awake, feeling the cold sheets against my skin, the ache in my chest heavier than any physical pain. I thought about the promises we made, the life we were supposed to build, and the man who seemed to have disappeared beneath the weight of his own ambitions. I felt a profound loneliness, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you question everything. Yet, beneath the hurt was a flicker of something else, a spark of resolve. If Mark couldn't be there for me when I needed him most, then I would have to be there for myself. I wasn't ready to give up on us, not yet, but I knew this moment marked a turning point. I realized that my health, my well-being, could no longer be sidelined by his busy schedule or his lack of empathy. The morning of the surgery arrived with a dull gray sky, mirroring the heaviness in my heart. Mark kissed me briefly on the forehead, mumbling something about hoping everything went fine before disappearing into the whirlwind of his day. I watched him go, feeling the finality of his absence settle over me like a shroud. As the nurse wheeled me down the corridor, I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the unknown. My body trembled, not from fear of the surgery itself, but from the realization that I was stepping into this battle alone. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the sharp tang of anxiety and hope. In that moment, I promised myself that no matter what happened, I would fight. Not just for my health, but for my dignity, my worth, and my future. Mark's absence had revealed the cracks in our marriage, but it also ignited a fire within me. I wasn't just a patient. I was a woman reclaiming control over her life. The surgery was a blur of lights and voices, and when I woke, the first thing I reached for was my phone. Mark's name flashed on the screen, but I hesitated before answering. My heart was heavy with disappointment, but also with a growing sense of clarity. I knew that the path ahead would be difficult, and that the man I married might not be the partner I needed, but I was ready to face it no matter what. That night, as I lay in the quiet hospital room, I stared at the ceiling and let the tears fall. Not just for the pain, but for the realization that sometimes, the people we love the most can fail us when we need them most. And sometimes the only person we can truly rely on is ourselves. Mark and I had built our life on promises, simple ones like always being there for each other, and grander ones like growing old side by side. I used to believe those promises were unbreakable. But after the surgery, his absence made me question everything I thought I knew about us. We met in college, two hopeful souls tangled in late-night conversations and shared dreams. Mark was magnetic, confident, ambitious, the kind of man who could light up a room with his laughter. I was drawn to that energy, imagining a future where we'd chase success and happiness together. When we married 5 years later, I thought our partnership was solid, built on mutual respect and love. Over the years, I had been the silent anchor in his whirlwind of ambition. While Mark climbed the corporate ladder with relentless focus, I managed our home, supported his goals, and kept the household running smoothly. I was proud of his achievements and believed our sacrifices were mutual. But the truth was, the scales were tipping. His career consumed him, and I was slowly fading into the background. When the diagnosis came, I hoped Mark would step up, that our vows would mean something more than words. But his reaction shattered that illusion. I remember the disbelief in my chest when he said he was too busy for my surgery, as if my health was just another item on his overflowing to-do list. It wasn't just neglect. It was a betrayal that left me aching in ways I hadn't anticipated. I replayed our early years in my mind, the dinners where he listened attentively, the weekends spent dreaming about travel and family, the way he used to hold my hand and promise we'd face everything together. Somewhere along the way, those moments had slipped away, replaced by meetings, deadlines, and a growing distance that neither of us acknowledged. The nights after my surgery were the hardest. Mark would come home late, exhausted and distracted, barely noticing the pain etched across my face or the swelling that made me wince with every movement. I tried to share my fears and frustrations, but he brushed them aside, his tired eyes avoiding mine. It was as if my vulnerability was an inconvenience, a distraction from his pressing responsibilities. One evening I sat in our living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows on the walls, while Mark checked his emails on the couch. I gathered the courage to speak, my voice trembling. "Mark, I need you. This isn't just about the surgery. It's about us, about being partners." He sighed, setting his phone down, but his expression remained distant. "Emily, I'm doing everything I can. You know how important my job is. I'm trying to provide for us." His words stabbed at me, not because they were untrue, but because they missed the point entirely. I wasn't asking for money or gifts. I was begging for presence, for empathy, for the man I married. But the Mark I knew seemed buried beneath layers of stress and ambition, leaving me alone with my pain. I started to notice the little things that had gone unnoticed before. The way he avoided eye contact when I mentioned my recovery, the way he'd leave the room when emotions ran high, the way our conversations became transactional, focused on logistics rather than feelings. Our marriage felt like a fragile house built on shifting sands. The disconnect wasn't just emotional. It seeped into our daily lives. Mark stopped asking about my appointments or how I was feeling. Instead, I found myself explaining everything to doctors and nurses alone, arranging follow-ups and managing medication schedules without his support. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders, and the loneliness became suffocating. I confided in my sister Jane during one of our rare phone calls. "I don't feel like the woman he married anymore," I whispered, tears threatening to spill. "He's here in body but not in spirit. I'm scared this is who he really is." Jane listened patiently, her voice gentle but firm. "You deserve someone who stands by you, Emily. Not just in good times but especially when it's hard." Her words echoed in my mind long after the call ended. I realized I had been making excuses for Mark, rationalizing his absence as the cost of ambition or stress. But deep down, I knew that neglect, no matter the reason, was a wound that wouldn't heal on its own. Despite the distance between us, I still held on to hope. I wanted to believe that Mark could change, that he could rediscover the man who once promised to be my partner in every sense. I watched for signs, a lingering touch, a sincere apology, a moment of vulnerability, but they rarely came. Instead, I found myself retreating, protecting my heart from further hurt. Our home, once a sanctuary filled with laughter and dreams, felt cold and empty. The silence between us was deafening, punctuated only by the hum of his laptop or the ticking of the clock. I longed for conversations that didn't revolve around schedules and obligations, for a touch that reassured rather than diminished. One afternoon, while I rested on the couch, Mark approached with tentative steps. "Emily, I know I haven't been there the way I should," he admitted, his voice low. "Work's been overwhelming, but that's no excuse. I'm sorry." His words were sincere, but after months of distance, they felt fragile, like a threadbare blanket barely covering the cold. I wanted to forgive him, to believe in our marriage's resilience. But I also recognized that apologies needed to be backed by action. I needed to see real change, consistent care, genuine presence, and a willingness to rebuild what had been broken. In the quiet moments alone, I reflected on my own role in this unraveling. Had I been too patient? Too forgiving? Had I allowed my needs to be overshadowed by his ambitions? These questions haunted me, but they also sparked a determination to prioritize my own well-being. I began journaling late at night, pouring out my fears, hopes, and frustrations onto the pages. Writing became a refuge, a way to process the pain and uncertainty. Through this, I slowly started to understand that my worth wasn't tied to Mark's approval or attention. I was more than the neglected wife. I was a woman deserving of respect and love. As the weeks passed, the distance between us remained, but so did a quiet resolve within me. I wasn't ready to give up on our marriage, but I couldn't continue living in the shadow of neglect. I needed to find my voice, to assert my needs, and to demand the partnership we once promised each other. The road ahead was unclear, tangled with hope and doubt, but one thing was certain. I would no longer let Mark's busyness define my worth or my future. Our marriage was at a crossroads, and I was beginning to see that the choices I made now would shape the rest of my life. The moment I realized Mark's indifference was not a temporary lapse, but a reflection of our fractured marriage, something inside me shifted. I couldn't keep waiting for him to show up when he'd already made it clear that his priorities lay elsewhere. I was left with a choice: drown in disappointment or find the strength to reclaim my life and health on my own terms. I started by confiding in Sarah, my oldest and dearest friend. We met at a small cafe one afternoon, the sunlight filtering softly through the windows as I fumbled with my coffee cup, nerves knotting my stomach. I poured out everything: Mark's dismissiveness, the loneliness, the fear of facing surgery and recovery alone. Sarah listened without interruption, her eyes steady and kind. "You're stronger than you think, Emily," she said softly. "But you can't do this by yourself. You need to take control now for you." Her words planted a seed of resolve, A whisper that maybe, just maybe, I could navigate this storm without losing myself. That night, lying in bed beside Mark, I made a decision. I would no longer wait for his support that might never come. I began whispering plans to myself, cautious but determined. I started researching everything about my surgery, hospital protocols, recovery times, even financial assistance programs. I wanted to be prepared, to take ownership of my health and future. The first step was financial. Mark had always managed the bulk of our finances, his name on most accounts and bills. I had always trusted him implicitly, but now I needed access and control. Quietly, I opened a separate bank account in my name, transferring small amounts from my personal savings. Money I'd tucked away over the years without fanfare. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I cut back on unnecessary expenses, skipping dinners out and canceling subscriptions I barely used. Every dollar saved felt like a brick in the foundation of my independence. I worked extra hours at the bookstore where I part-time, the familiar scent of paper and coffee grounding me amid the chaos of my emotions. Meanwhile, I reached out to my doctor's office, scheduling appointments and confirming dates. I asked countless questions, determined to understand every detail of the procedure and recovery. The nurses and staff became my unexpected allies, their warmth contrasting sharply with Mark's coldness. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. I kept my preparations secret from Mark. I wasn't ready for his dismissive comments or the inevitable guilt trips. Our conversations became more strained. He noticed my distance but chalked it up to stress. I played along, masking the turmoil beneath a veneer of calm. It was exhausting but necessary. One afternoon I met Sarah again, this time at her apartment. We spread medical brochures and notes across her kitchen table, plotting out my recovery timeline. She held my hand and said, "You're taking back control, Emily. That's brave." Her support was a balm to my bruised spirit. I confided in her my fears, not just about the surgery, but about the uncertain future with Mark. What if he never changes? What if this is the man I'm stuck with? I whispered, tears threatening to spill. Sarah squeezed my hand. "Then you'll have built your strength to stand on your own. No one can take that away from you." With each passing day, my resolve deepened. I began to envision a life where I was the protagonist, not a sidelined character waiting for rescue. I imagined waking up in a home filled with peace rather than tension, where my needs mattered as much as anyone else's. Despite the growing distance between Mark and me, I didn't give up on the possibility of reconciliation. I hoped that by taking these steps, I might inspire him to rejoin me in this fight. But I braced myself for the reality that I might have to face this journey solo. The night before my surgery, I sat at the kitchen table, the sterile hospital packet laid out before me. Mark was in the other room, his voice muffled through the walls as he spoke on the phone, busy as ever. I felt a pang of sadness but also a fierce pride. I had done this, planned, prepared, and taken charge. I texted Sarah a simple message. "Tomorrow is the day. Thank you for being my anchor." Her reply was immediate. "You've got this. I'm here every step." That night, as I packed my bag for the hospital, I whispered a promise to myself. No matter what happened with Mark or our marriage, I would fight for my health, my dignity, and my future. I would no longer be the woman sidelined by someone else's indifference. And with that promise, I finally felt a small but steady flame of hope ignite within me. The morning of my surgery arrived with a quiet stillness that felt almost surreal. Mark had left early, murmuring something about a conference call, and I was left alone in the house, the silence heavy and unfamiliar. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight of solitude, not the lonely ache I'd grown accustomed to, but a strange, empowering quiet that told me I was standing on my own. I double-checked my hospital bag, making sure I had everything: my ID, insurance card, a change of clothes, and a small notebook where I jotted down questions and reminders. Every detail mattered. This was my moment to prove to myself that I could navigate this critical chapter without relying on Mark's absent support. Arriving at the hospital, the sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with a blend of nervous energy and calm professionalism. The nurses greeted me warmly, their smiles genuine and reassuring. I realized in that moment that while Mark had been too busy to be there, these strangers were stepping in to fill some of the void, their kindness a balm to my anxious heart. The pre-op room was a blur of white walls and clinical sounds, The beeping monitors, the rustle of gowns, the soft murmur of staff preparing me for surgery. I sat on the narrow bed trying to steady my breathing, clutching the nurse's hand as the anesthesia took hold. The thought that I was embarking on this journey alone was both frightening and strangely liberating. When I awoke, the first sensation was a dull ache radiating from my abdomen and a foggy haze clouding my mind. The room was dim, the soft hum of machines a constant backdrop. My first instinct was to reach for my phone, to hear Mark's voice, but then I remembered I was on my own. And that realization no longer filled me with despair. Instead, it sparked a flicker of pride. I had survived the operation without him. The days that followed were a mixture of pain, discomfort, and slow recovery. I was discharged with strict instructions: rest, medications, and follow-up appointments. The reality of managing everything alone settled heavily on my shoulders. Mark's absence was palpable. He didn't visit, didn't call, and barely acknowledged the ordeal I had just endured. I found myself relying more and more on Sarah, who became my lifeline. She dropped by with meals, helped with errands, and offered a listening ear when the loneliness threatened to consume me. Her presence was a reminder that I wasn't truly alone, that support could come from unexpected places. Managing my recovery independently forced me to confront not only physical pain but emotional wounds I had long suppressed. I grappled with feelings of abandonment and betrayal, but also with an emerging sense of self-reliance. I was learning that my strength didn't depend on Mark's presence. It was something I carried within. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch wrapped in a soft blanket, I made a list of everything I had accomplished in the past weeks, arranging the surgery, managing finances, facing the pain head-on. Each item was a testament to my resilience. For the first time, I saw myself not as a victim but as a survivor. When Mark finally came home that evening, his face was drawn, and there was a hesitance in his step. He offered a brief, "How are you feeling?" But it felt distant, like a question asked out of obligation rather than genuine concern. I answered with a simple, "I'm managing," which was both true and defiant. That night, we sat at opposite ends of the couch, the space between us a silent chasm. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap, but the memories of his absence during my darkest hours held me back. I realized that this surgery wasn't just about healing my body, it was about confronting the fractures in our marriage. In the following weeks, I continued to navigate my recovery alone, each small victory reinforcing my independence. I mastered the art of managing medications, scheduling follow-ups, and pacing myself through physical therapy. With every step, I grew more confident in my ability to care for myself, no longer waiting for Mark's involvement that rarely came. The physical scars from the surgery were healing, but the emotional scars required a different kind of attention. I began to journal regularly, pouring out my thoughts and fears, using words to untangle the complex feelings simmering beneath the surface. Writing became a refuge, a way to process the pain and envision a future where I was the center of my own story. Mark's sporadic attempts to check in were met with polite but guarded responses. I wasn't ready to let him back into the space he had neglected, and I sensed he was becoming aware of the distance growing between us. Yet, despite the tension, I remained open to dialogue, hoping that our marriage might still find a way back from the brink. One afternoon, during a follow-up appointment, the surgeon praised my progress, noting that my recovery was going well despite the challenges. "You're doing great," she said with a smile. Her words resonated deeply. I was doing great, not because of anyone else but because of the strength I had found within myself. As I left the clinic, the sun warm on my face, I felt a shift in my perspective. The surgery had been a crucible, forcing me to confront painful truths, but it had also revealed my resilience. I was no longer the woman waiting for Mark's support. I was becoming someone who could stand tall on her own. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. The woman staring back had changed. There was a new determination in her eyes, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. It was the face of someone who had faced fear and abandonment and chosen to fight. Though the road ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer willing to be sidelined in my own life. Mark's busyness had left a void, but in filling that space with my own strength, I was beginning to reclaim the woman I was meant to be. The first time I confronted Mark about his absence during my surgery, the words felt heavy on my tongue, But I knew I couldn't keep burying the pain. I needed answers or at least some acknowledgement. That evening, as he sat at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone, I took a deep breath and spoke, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Mark, you weren't there when I needed you the most. During the surgery recovery, you were too busy. Why? The question hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. He looked up, eyes tired but defensive. Emily, I told you work was overwhelming. I couldn't just drop everything. You knew how important that quarter was. I shook my head, frustration bubbling. I don't care about the quarter. I needed my husband, not the CEO. You promised me support, partnership. Instead, I was alone. His jaw tightened. I'm sorry you felt that way, but I was doing what I had to do for us. For us. My voice cracked. It didn't feel like it. It felt like I was invisible. The conversation spiraled into silence, neither of us knowing how to bridge the growing chasm between us. His lack of empathy was a bitter pill, and I realized that the man I married was fading beneath layers of stress and ambition. In the days that followed, I watched Mark struggle with guilt, though he never fully expressed it. He attempted small gestures, a text here, a brief check-in there, but they felt insufficient, almost perfunctory. The emotional distance between us was palpable, a silent barrier that neither wanted to acknowledge openly. I found myself conflicted. Part of me yearned for the Mark I knew, the man who once held my hand through storms and whispered promises of forever. But the reality was stark. His priorities had shifted, and my needs had been sidelined. One afternoon, I tried to reach out again, hoping to spark a genuine conversation. Mark, can we talk about what happened? About us? I asked cautiously. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Emily, I don't know if I can be the husband you want right now. Work is demanding and I'm stretched thin. His admission was both painful and illuminating. I realized that the partnership I craved required more than words. It needed time, effort, and a willingness to put us first. And if he couldn't do that, I had to start asking hard questions about my own future. As the weeks passed, I focused on my healing, both physical and emotional. I leaned on Sarah and a small circle of friends who reminded me of my worth. Their support was a lifeline, especially when Mark's attempts at reconciliation felt hollow. One evening, Mark invited me to dinner, a rare gesture after months of cold distance. The restaurant was quiet, the dim lighting casting soft shadows. Over the meal, he spoke hesitantly. Emily, I realize I've taken you for granted. I want to make things right. I studied his face, searching for sincerity. It's not just about saying sorry, Mark. It's about showing up, being present, supporting me when I need you. He nodded slowly. I know. I want to try. Despite his words, I remained guarded. My heart had been bruised, and trust wasn't something I could rebuild overnight. I needed to see consistency, to feel valued beyond moments of apology. That night I lay awake, wrestling with conflicting emotions. Part of me hoped for a second chance. Part of me feared further heartbreak. The surgery had revealed cracks in our marriage I couldn't ignore, but it also sparked a determination to reclaim my self-respect. In the days that followed, I observed Mark more closely. His efforts to connect were tentative but genuine. He attended a follow-up appointment with me, asked questions and listened. I allowed myself to feel cautiously optimistic, though I remained aware of the fragile nature of our situation. Still, doubts lingered. Could the man who once prioritized work over our marriage truly change? Was I willing to risk more pain for a chance at healing? One afternoon, I confided in Sarah, voicing my fears. I want to believe in him, but I'm scared this is just the beginning of more disappointment. Sarah squeezed my hand. You have to protect yourself, Emily, but don't close your heart completely. Trust your instincts. Her words resonated. I realized that the path forward wasn't clear-cut. It required balancing hope with caution, love with self-preservation. As the weeks turned into months, Mark and I navigated a tentative truce. We communicated more, shared moments of tenderness, and slowly rebuilt a foundation. But beneath the surface, I grappled with the knowledge that true healing would demand more than just effort. It required a transformation of priorities and values. The surgery had been a catalyst, exposing the vulnerabilities in our marriage and forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths. Mark's refusal to support me during that critical time was a wound that couldn't be ignored. Yet, it also opened a door to honest dialogue and the possibility of growth. I knew that the journey ahead would be challenging. Trust had to be earned, respect reestablished, and love rekindled. Whether our marriage survived depended not just on Mark's willingness to change, but on my ability to forgive and to stand firm in my own worth. In the quiet moments alone, I reflected on the choices before me. I was no longer willing to settle for neglect or indifference. I deserved a partner who valued me as much as his career, who stood beside me in times of crisis, and who honored the promises we made. The confrontation with Mark was just the beginning, a painful but necessary step toward clarity. I was learning that standing up for myself wasn't an act of rebellion but an act of survival. And whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it with eyes wide open and a heart guarded yet hopeful. Recovering from surgery was supposed to be a time for healing, but for me it became a crucible of clarity. As the physical pain faded, I found an unexpected strength blossoming within. A clarity about my worth and the life I wanted to lead. Mark's attempts to reconnect were tentative, but I kept my guard up, wary of falling back into a pattern that had left me feeling invisible. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the living room window, Mark sat across from me, nervously fidgeting with his coffee mug. "Emily, I know I wasn't there when you needed me," he began, voice tinged with regret. "I want to make things right. Can we try again?" His words stirred a mixture of hope and hesitation inside me. I wanted to believe in the possibility of change, but the memories of neglect lingered like shadows. "It's not just about trying, Mark," I replied softly. "It's about showing up, being present when it matters." He nodded earnestly, but I sensed the weight of his own struggles beneath his apologies. Work had consumed him, yes, but there was more. A disconnect that neither of us had fully addressed. Our marriage was at a crossroads, and I realized that healing would require more than words. In the weeks that followed, I focused on my own recovery and growth. I reconnected with friends I'd drifted from, like Sarah and Jane, whose unwavering support reminded me of my strength. I began attending a local book club, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. The discussions, the laughter, the shared stories, it was a balm to my soul. Mark saw this blossoming independence with a mix of admiration and uncertainty. Sometimes I caught him watching me with a look I hadn't seen in years, a flicker of the man who had once been my partner in everything. Yet the distance between us remained, a silent barrier that neither dared to cross fully. One evening, after a particularly lively book club meeting, I returned home feeling lighter than I had in months. Mark greeted me at the door, offering a tentative smile. "You seem happy," he said. "I am," I replied honestly. "I'm rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten." He nodded slowly, as if absorbing the truth of my words. "I want to be part of that again," he said quietly. The path to rebuilding trust and connection was neither straight nor smooth. We tried therapy, attending sessions that peeled back layers of resentment and misunderstanding. Sometimes the conversations were painful, exposing wounds that hadn't fully healed. Other times they offered glimpses of hope, a shared laugh, a moment of vulnerability. Through it all, I learned to listen not just to Mark but to myself. I recognized the importance of setting boundaries, of demanding respect and empathy. I began to understand that love alone wasn't enough. It had to be accompanied by action and commitment. Mark made efforts to adjust his schedule, carving out time for us that wasn't overshadowed by work. He surprised me with small gestures, a favorite meal cooked, an impromptu date night, a hand held during a difficult moment. These acts, though simple, were powerful reminders that he was trying. Yet I remained cautious. The wounds from his absence during my surgery weren't easily forgotten. I needed consistency, not just moments of effort. I measured his actions against his words, seeking alignment. Throughout this process, I also nurtured my own passions and goals. I enrolled in an online course to further my career, something I'd postponed for years while supporting Mark's ambitions. The sense of accomplishment fueled my confidence, reminding me that I was more than a patient or a neglected wife. I was a woman reclaiming her identity. There were days when doubt crept in, when the fear of repeating old patterns loomed large. I questioned whether our marriage could survive the fractures, or if it was destined to crumble. But each time I reminded myself of the progress we'd made. The conversations, the shared moments, the mutual willingness to try. One afternoon, as we walked through the park hand in hand, Mark turned to me and said, "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to build a future with you. A future where we're equals, partners in every sense." His words stirred something deep within me. The journey was far from over, and the path uncertain. But in that moment I felt a flicker of hope, a fragile yet resilient belief that love, when nurtured with care and respect, could endure. As I looked into his eyes, I realized that my healing wasn't just about recovering from surgery. It was about reclaiming my worth, setting boundaries, and choosing a life where I was seen and valued. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but I was no longer afraid. I was learning to stand tall, to demand the respect I deserved, and to love myself fiercely. Mark's presence was no longer a given but a choice, one we both had to make every day. And for the first time in a long while, I was ready to face that choice with an open heart and a clear mind. The days that followed my tentative conversations with Mark were a whirlwind of emotions, each one pulling me between hope and hesitation. I could feel myself growing stronger, more certain of who I was beyond the shadows of neglect and disappointment. The surgery had forced me to confront truths I'd long avoided, but it also opened doors I hadn't dared to walk through before. I started reconnecting with friends I'd drifted from over the years, those who reminded me of my worth, and who I used to be before my world became consumed by Mark's ambitions. Sarah was my rock, the one who never judged or doubted me. Jane, my sister, became a source of practical advice and unwavering support. Together, they anchored me as I navigated this fragile new phase of my life. One afternoon I joined a local art class, a small step I'd always wanted to take but never prioritized. The smell of paint and the quiet focus of the studio were therapeutic, a reminder that I was more than a patient or a wife. I was a woman reclaiming her passions. The instructor, a kind woman named Claire, encouraged me to express myself boldly, and I found solace in mixing colors and creating shapes that mirrored my inner turmoil and resilience. Mark noticed the changes in me. One evening he hesitantly remarked, "You seem different, more alive." His words caught me off guard. For so long I'd been the quiet, invisible partner, and now I was stepping into the light of my own life. Yet, beneath my evolving confidence was a cautious heart, unwilling to fully trust that Mark would follow suit. Despite his occasional attempts to apologize and reconnect, I held back, setting boundaries that felt both necessary and painful. I wasn't ready to be swept back into the old rhythm of our marriage without real change. The past months had shown me how easily neglect could take root, and I was determined not to let that happen again. I found myself spending more time with friends, attending book clubs, dinners, and weekend hikes. These moments of connection filled spaces that had long been empty, reminding me that I didn't need to rely solely on Mark for companionship or validation. I was reclaiming my social life, my interests, my joy. At work, I decided to take on new responsibilities, pushing myself to grow professionally. It was empowering to focus on goals that were mine alone, not tethered to Mark's career or expectations. With each achievement, I felt a surge of pride and a reminder that my identity wasn't defined by my marriage. Mark's efforts to apologize became more consistent. He sent flowers unannounced, left notes of encouragement, and occasionally planned quiet evenings just for us. These gestures warmed my heart, but I remained vigilant, knowing that true change required more than occasional kindness. It demanded sustained commitment. One evening, after a particularly heartfelt conversation, Mark admitted, "I realize how much I took for granted, how my busyness made you feel small. I want to be better, for you, for us." His sincerity was palpable, but I also sensed the heavy burden he carried. Work pressures, expectations, and the challenge of redefining himself within our marriage. Change was hard for both of us. I told him, "I need to see that you're willing to fight for this, not just with words but with actions. I'm willing to try, but I won't settle for less than respect and partnership." He nodded, a silent promise hanging in the air between us. Still, cracks remained. Old wounds surfaced in quiet moments, miscommunications, frustrations, and the lingering memory of his absence during my surgery. I grappled with feelings of anger and sadness that sometimes spilled over in unexpected ways. Therapy helped us both, providing tools to navigate these challenges, but the journey was far from smooth. Through it all, I discovered a newfound sense of self-respect. I learned to voice my needs clearly, to set boundaries firmly, and to recognize when my well-being was at stake. Mark's attempts to reconnect were no longer the sole measure of my happiness. I was building a life that honored my worth regardless of his actions. One weekend, I attended a women's retreat focused on empowerment and healing. Surrounded by stories of resilience and courage, I felt a deep kinship with others who had faced betrayal and emerged stronger. Their strength fueled my own, reinforcing the belief that I deserved a marriage rooted in mutual care and respect. Returning home, I felt renewed but also aware of the delicate balance I walked daily between hope for reconciliation and the imperative of self-preservation. Mark and I were rebuilding, but the foundation was fragile. Our conversations became more honest, sometimes raw. I shared my fears openly, and he listened, sometimes with tears in his eyes. We both acknowledged that rebuilding trust wasn't about erasing the past, but about creating a future where pain didn't define us. Despite the progress, I remained vigilant. Every promise needed to be matched with consistent effort. I refused to be sidelined again, to be the woman whose needs were secondary to someone else's ambitions. Through this process, I also rediscovered joy in small things. A quiet morning with coffee, a walk in the park, laughter with friends. These moments reminded me that happiness wasn't dependent on Mark's presence or approval. It was something I could cultivate within myself. Mark and I continued to navigate this complex dance of healing and growth. Some days were filled with hope and connection, others with doubt and distance. But through it all, I was learning to stand firm in my worth and to demand the partnership I deserved. The surgery that once felt like a crisis had become a catalyst, not just for my physical healing, but for a profound transformation of self. I was no longer willing to accept neglect or invisibility. I was reclaiming my voice, my passions, and my life. Whether Mark could fully meet me where I was remained to be seen. But I knew one thing with certainty. I would no longer sacrifice my happiness or dignity for the sake of a marriage that didn't honor me. I was ready to build a future, one where respect and love were not just promises but realities. A few weeks after rekindling small connections with Mark, I found myself at a company gala, a glittering event where success was celebrated and socializing was mandatory. I'd hesitated about attending, worried about the suffocating atmosphere that often accompanied these gatherings, but I wanted to try, to show Mark that I could step into his world on my own terms. The ballroom was vast, filled with clusters of people dressed in shimmering gowns and tailored suits, laughter mingling with the clink of glasses. Mark navigated the crowd with ease, shaking hands, sharing smiles, and exchanging business pleasantries. I followed behind, feeling like an outsider in a world that had long felt foreign and unwelcoming. As the evening wore on, I noticed the way Mark's colleagues greeted him with familiarity and deference, their conversations revolving around deals, deadlines, and corporate victories. I tried to engage in small talk, but the veneer of camaraderie felt hollow, and I sensed the invisible barrier separating me from their world. At one point, I overheard Mark laughing at a joke I didn't understand, surrounded by friends who clearly shared a history I wasn't part of. The realization struck me hard. I'd been an observer in his life, not a participant. The loneliness I'd felt during my surgery resurfaced, sharper and more painful in this crowd. Seeking a quiet corner, I found myself near the buffet, nursing a glass of water and trying to steady my racing heart. A woman approached, her smile warm but cautious. "Hi, I'm Claire," she said, extending a hand. "I don't think we've met. You're Mark's wife, right?" I nodded, grateful for the friendly gesture. Claire was charming and genuine, and we fell into an easy conversation about books and travel, topics far removed from corporate jargon. For a moment I felt seen, not as an accessory to Mark's status, but as a woman with her own stories and interests. Yet, even in this brief connection, I couldn't shake the undercurrent of isolation. Claire's subtle glances toward Mark and his friends reminded me that I was still on the periphery, a guest in a world that wasn't truly mine. Later, as Mark rejoined me, I sensed his frustration. "You seem distant tonight," he said quietly. I hesitated, then admitted, "I feel like I don't belong here, like I'm watching your life from the outside." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry. I want you to be part of this world, but I know it's hard." The truth was, I wanted to be part of his life, but not at the cost of losing myself. The gala was a stark reminder of how far apart we drifted, not just emotionally but socially. Days later, I confided in Sarah about the evening. I felt invisible, I said softly, like I was pretending to be someone I'm not. Sarah listened, her eyes filled with empathy. That feeling of isolation can be suffocating, especially when it's in the presence of the person you want to connect with most. Her words mirrored my own doubts. Was I willing to continue adapting to fit into Mark's world? Or was it time to carve out my own path, regardless of where that led us? Around that time, I met David at a local coffee shop. A kind, thoughtful man with a gentle smile and a keen interest in art and literature. Our conversations flowed effortlessly, filled with laughter and shared curiosities. David made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced in years, igniting a spark of connection that was both exhilarating and confusing. I found myself torn between the familiar tension with Mark and the comforting ease of this new friendship. David didn't know the full story of my marriage, and I wasn't ready to share it. But his presence reminded me that I deserved companionship that nourished my soul. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult conversation with Mark about our future, I met David for coffee. His attentive eyes and gentle encouragement offered a refuge from the storm of uncertainty swirling in my mind. He asked, "What do you want, Emily? Not from anyone else but for yourself." The question lingered long after our meeting ended. I realized I'd spent so much time trying to salvage a marriage that often left me feeling alone, that I'd forgotten to ask myself what I truly wanted. The internal conflict grew. I loved Mark, the man I married, the partner I once trusted. But the version of him I saw now was distant, wrapped up in a world that left little room for me. David represented possibility, a chance to be valued and cherished in ways I hadn't felt in years. As I navigated these conflicting emotions, I knew I had to confront the reality of my situation. I needed to decide whether to continue striving for a marriage that strained my heart, or to embrace the uncertain path of independence and self-discovery. One evening, I sat alone in our quiet living room, the weight of these choices pressing down on me. I pulled out my journal and wrote, "I am tired of feeling invisible. I want to be seen, loved, and respected, not just by others but by myself." That night, sleep eluded me as I wrestled with fear and hope, love and loss. The future was uncertain, but one truth was clear. I could no longer ignore the loneliness that had shadowed me for too long. The gala, the conversations with Claire, the friendship with David, they were all signs pointing toward a crossroads. And I knew that whatever path I chose, it would require courage, honesty, and a fierce commitment to my own happiness. The day I sent Mark the hospital bill along with the divorce papers, I felt a strange mix of liberation and heartbreak swirling inside me. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. It was the culmination of months, no years, of neglect, disappointment, and quiet suffering. But that moment marked the turning point where I refused to be invisible any longer. I sat at the kitchen table, the bill and paper spread before me like silent witnesses to the unraveling of our marriage. My hands trembled slightly as I typed the message that accompanied them. "I'm done waiting for you to be there. This is what your absence has cost us. I deserve better." It wasn't revenge, it was truth. For too long, Mark's busyness had overshadowed my needs, his indifference during my surgery the clearest betrayal. I had tried to forgive, to rebuild, to hope. But hope alone couldn't fill the void left by his absence. When Mark received the message, his initial reaction was shock. I could see it in his eyes during our next conversation, the disbelief that I had taken such a definitive step. "Emily, please, can't we talk about this?" he begged, voice strained. I looked at him steadily, feeling the strength that had taken root within me. "Mark, we've talked. I needed you when it mattered most, and you weren't there. This isn't about anger. It's about reclaiming my life," he pleaded, promising to change, to make amends, to prove he could be the husband I deserved. But the wounds ran deep, and I knew that words without sustained action were empty. In the weeks that followed, the tension between us was palpable. Our conversations were fraught with unresolved pain and guarded emotions. Mark oscillated between remorse and frustration, struggling to accept the reality of our separation. Meanwhile, I focused on building a life centered on my own well-being. I leaned on Sarah and Jane, whose unwavering support reminded me I was not alone. I also deepened my connection with David, whose kindness and attentiveness offered a glimpse of what true partnership could feel like. Filing for divorce was both terrifying and empowering. The paperwork symbolized not just an end but a beginning, the chance to redefine myself outside the confines of a marriage that no longer served me. Some nights, loneliness crept in, whispering doubts and fears. But I held fast to the knowledge that I had chosen dignity over neglect, self-respect over complacency. I also began therapy, confronting the emotional wounds left by years of neglect and betrayal. The sessions were challenging but necessary, helping me untangle the complex web of love, pain, and hope that had defined my marriage. As I navigated this new chapter, I rediscovered passions and dreams that had been overshadowed. I enrolled in classes, pursued hobbies, and reconnected with friends. Each step was a testament to my resilience and determination to live authentically. When Mark and I finally met to discuss the logistics of our separation, the atmosphere was heavy but civil. We spoke with honesty and respect, acknowledging the pain but also the growth that had come from our shared journey. I realized that ending our marriage wasn't a failure but an act of courage, a declaration that I refused to settle for less than I deserved. In the quiet moments that followed, I felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to walk. I was no longer defined by Mark's absence or indifference. I was defined by my strength, my choices, and my hope for a future filled with respect, love, and joy. The day I filed the separation papers, a weight lifted from my chest. A mixture of relief and quiet exhilaration washing over me like the first breath after being underwater too long. It wasn't just a legal act, it was a reclamation of my identity, a declaration that my worth was not tied to a man who chose busyness over me when it mattered most. I sat in my small sunlit apartment, the soft hum of the city outside my window mingling with the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. The papers lay neatly stacked on the coffee table, a tangible symbol of the new path I had carved for myself. It was terrifying and liberating all at once. Jake, the local handyman I had met through a friend, knocked gently at the door that afternoon. His easy smile and warm presence had become a comforting constant in the chaos of recent months. I invited him in, grateful for the normalcy he brought into my life. As we sat together over tea, I shared with him the journey, the betrayal, the surgery, the long months of healing and fighting for myself. Jake listened with quiet empathy, his eyes never leaving mine, making me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. "I'm proud of you, Emily," he said softly. "It takes courage to choose yourself." His words resonated deeply. For so long, I had been lost in a marriage that diminished me. But now I was stepping into a life where my happiness and health were priorities. We talked late into the evening, laughter mingling with moments of vulnerability. Jake didn't rush me or expect anything. He simply offered companionship and understanding, a stark contrast to the indifference I had endured. In the weeks that followed, I began to build routines that centered on self-care and growth. Morning walks in the park, yoga classes, evenings spent reading or journaling, each act a brick in the foundation of my new life. I reconnected with old friends, nurtured new relationships, and even found joy in solitude. The freedom to make choices for myself without guilt or hesitation was intoxicating. Mark remained a part of my past, a chapter that had closed with difficult but necessary finality. I didn't harbor bitterness. Instead, I carried lessons about love, boundaries, and the power of self-respect. One afternoon, as I stood on my apartment balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was ready to face it with open arms and a resilient heart. I was no longer defined by neglect or absence but by the strength I had discovered within. The future was mine to shape, a life filled with joy, respect, and the freedom to be unapologetically me.